Hello guys! Alright, so we're going to go ahead and continue on with this next lesson looking at the diencephalon. As we talked about in our last lesson, the diencephalon is going to be right in the middle of the brain, so it is not something that you can see from the outside. So you would have to cut into the brain to actually be able to see this region. There are three parts to your diencephalon. You have your thalamus, your hypothalamus, and your epithalamus. Okay. Here is another diagram where we see the hypothalamus, which is on the bottommost side, okay, of the brain. So hypo meaning below, okay. The thalamus, which is going to be right here, okay. So thalamus, hypothalamus, and then the epithalamus you can't really see very well here, okay. But the epithalamus is going to be hanging out more towards the outside, epi, okay, of this particular region of the brain. Alright, so if we jump right into this and we go and look at the thalamus. So the thalamus is going to surround the third ventricle. If you remember, there are 4 ventricles in the brain, okay? And this third one is going to have the thalamus surrounding it, okay? The job of the thalamus is the relay station for sensory impulses. So all of the sensory messages that your body obtains through sight and smell and hearing and feeling and tasting, all of those sensory impulses are going to go through the thalamus before they go to other parts of the brain. In my mind, I kind of think of the thalamus as like the train station or maybe like the operator, because it's going to dictate where those messages go in the brain. So, for example, if you look out your window and you see a bird, right? Now, as that message that travels from your eyes into your optic nerve is actually going to pass through your thalamus, okay, which is right where this red arrow is. It's going to pass through this thalamus, okay, and the thalamus is going to say, okay, this is a vision message, okay, it's going to be sent to the vision cortex, which is in the occipital lobe of the brain, to be interpreted, so that you know, oh, I've seen one of those before, that's a bird. Okay. It will also transfer impulses to the correct part of the cortex, as we mentioned, for localization and interpretation. That's just the part where it's saying, basically where it's sending that message to the part of the brain where it's supposed to go. Now the hypothalamus, so hypo means like below, so this is the part of the diencephalon that is below the thalamus, and it's its own specific part. And it is important in your autonomic nervous system. If you remember from earlier this chapter, we talked about how autonomic sounds like the word automatic. And so it's going to be responsible for a lot of the involuntary things. Okay. So, for example, it does things like helps to regulate body temperature, helps to control water balance with the help of the excretory system, it helps to regulate metabolism, it helps some of your involuntary organs operate, okay, all of those involuntary things that we don't really have to put any conscious control. This is the part of the brain that helps them do that. Right. And it's also an important part of the limbic system. The limbic system is like the emotional system of the human body. It ties right in with like the endocrine or the hormonal system, okay, and it's responsible for a lot of the emotions that we have as humans. One of the big parts of the hypothalamus is actually the pituitary gland. Okay, and we know the pituitary gland is activated, especially at puberty, which causes you as middle schoolers, but you're past that now, so it's okay, causes those middle schoolers to have those mood swings and fluctuations and all those things that I'm glad I don't have to deal with too much as high school teachers. Alright, so that pituitary gland is responsible for a lot of those feelings and emotions, and what's happening is that, like during puberty, we see those mood swings so much because your hormones are bouncing back and forth at that time, okay? As you enter towards the end of puberty, into your high school and adult years, those hormones start to level out, thankfully. Okay. And then the last part of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. And the epithalamus is also going to be one of the structures that helps form the roof of that third ventricle. Okay, so the epithalamus is going to be found at the top of that third opening that we have in our brain. Okay. Now, it does house the pineal gland. The pineal gland is another important hormonal structure. It helps to regulate some metabolism stuff. It helps to regulate some blood sugar stuff and some metabolism as well. Also in your epithalamus, it will also include the choroid plexus, which is a structure that helps to form that cerebral spinal fluid, which kind of makes sense that it sits on top of the ventricle, because this is going to be the structure, since it is making this fluid, that fluid is going to go down into that third ventricle and disperse into the other ventricles. Okay, remember, cerebral spinal fluid, super important because it makes this watery cushion that our brain kind of sits within, and our spinal cord too, to give it some protection. Because as we've discussed, it's not the strongest organ we have in that human body. Alright, so all three of those parts make up the region called the diencephalon. Okay, we're going to then get into our brainstem portion of things. Okay, and with our brainstem, so your brainstem is going to connect your brain to your spinal cord. And here we find a lot of the primitive functions for our human body. So things like control of heart rate, breathing, and respiration functions. We'll see some of the other involuntary things are going to be found here too. So notice your hypothalamus is really, really close to your brainstem, okay, which makes sense because it also helps with some of the primitive functions along with this brainstem. Now, just like our diencephalon, the brainstem also has three parts. It has the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Yes, it's a real human part. If I were with you guys, I'm sure one of you could recite that quote from the Adam Sandler movie. Something about angry alligators and something, something, something. I always have a kid who can. I never remember it. Alright, so yes, we do have a medulla oblongata. The first part here is our midbrain. The midbrain is composed mostly of nerve fibers, okay, almost like cables in a way, which makes kind of sense because that's going to be the part that all those cables, all those neurons have to go through to get into the thalamus, which will then go into different parts of the brain. Now, it has two bulging fiber tracts, okay, meaning it's got like two big bumps sticking out of it when we get a better look at some of the other diagrams. And these fiber tracts are called cerebral peduncles. Okay, so you see the word like peduncle, looks like pedal, which is just referring to it almost looks like two little feet coming out of this particular part of the brain. Okay. And really those 2 feet are going to correspond with the 2 different hemispheres of the brain. It also has 4 rounded protrusions, okay, called the corpora quadrigemina. Whew, we love brain terms in the morning. Okay, and this is going to be one of the areas where we have reflex centers for vision and for hearing. Okay, for vision and hearing. And then the midbrain, I'll keep using this diagram here. The midbrain you can see right here in the red. Okay, right underneath the diencephalon and the thalamus and hypothalamus, right in front of your cerebellum, underneath the rest of your cerebrum. Now, the blue part here in this diagram is called the pons, and the pons is going to be, in my mind, it kind of looks like the Adam's apple of our brainstem, right? But it's just maybe how I picture things. It's the bulging center part of the brainstem. Now, your pons is important because it too, while consisting of fiber tracts, because, well, it's coming from the spinal cord into the brain, so it makes sense that there's a lot of these fiber tracts going through it. It is going to be primarily responsible for the control of breathing. Okay. Which also kind of makes a little bit of sense because if you take a look at the rest of the human body, here we have our tubes from our nose and from our mouth, and then your windpipe would go right down here, so those nerves really wouldn't have to travel very far to get to the pons, which would be responsible for sending on those messages of breathing as well. Okay, so remember, This is a lot of the involuntary stuff, which we find right here. And then the last part, and everyone's favorite word to say in this chapter, medulla oblongata. All right, so the medulla oblongata is the lowest part of the brainstem. If you go back, right here in the green, that's your medulla oblongata. Now, sometimes in your diagrams, they don't put the entire name on there because it's kind of long. So sometimes they just shorten it to medulla. Okay, but technical name is medulla oblongata. And so, lowest part of the brainstem, it's going to be the part that actually merges into the spinal cord. Okay. And just like the rest of our brainstem, it's going to have a whole bunch of important fiber tracts, and it's going to be in charge of a lot of the control centers, so things like heart rate, okay, blood pressure regulation, the ability to swallow, which is important when we're talking about digestive system, and even like things like vomiting, which is a way that your body reacts to getting rid of wastes, or a response to like sickness, or trying to get rid of all of the bacteria that you might have if you have like a stomach virus. We see that all of those controls are right here in the medulla oblongata. That being said, since this is such an important function, okay, since this is such an important part of our brain, when people get injuries to like their brainstem, especially the medulla oblongata, it's usually a really bad turn of events. Okay, most people do not survive brainstem injuries because all of that involuntary stuff is housed right there. Okay? So it's actually better to injure your cerebrum, okay, which is that upper part, compared to your medulla oblongata or any of the other brainstem areas, just for the fact that all your primitive needs for survival, all those control centers are housed right here. And I feel like I took this out of your notes. So this might be, if you're following along with the fill-in notes, I think I took this out. It's not going to be a big part on the test. I'll talk through it, but I think in past years I had to make a couple cuts in content, and this got cut, but that's okay. So how all of this works, okay, it's called a reticular formation. If you remember, reticular tissue had that black branching appearance from chapter 3. All those messages go from the spinal cord, okay, up into the brain. Now it's all going to pass through that thalamus, which is right about here, and that is going to be how, and that thalamus is going to send it out to all of these different parts of your brain. Now the reticular formation, or the reticular tissue, okay, that's playing a role here, is going to play a role in both interpreting the messages. It's also going to help with like your sleep patterns and your awake patterns. Okay, so when people have sleeping disorders, they'll sometimes look at this area right on the outside of the brainstem. Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, and the last part of the brain that I want to leave you off with, we'll save like the coverings and everything else for another day, but your cerebellum. So remember, at the beginning of this brain section, I told you like a lot of times students confuse cerebrum with cerebellum, just because they kind of sound the same. Okay, remember, cerebrum is the big part. Cerebellum's like this tiny brain at the very back. Sometimes it's even nicknamed the tiny brain. Okay, so here we have a structure that also has two hemispheres. So there's like a right side of your cerebellum and a left side of your cerebellum, and it has the same wrinkly appearance as the cerebrum. However, the folds are a lot smaller and they're a lot closer together. Sometimes people compare this to cauliflower. That's kind of weird. I don't like comparing anatomy to food, okay? But that's what I've heard it compared to before. This cerebellum, as we mentioned earlier this chapter, is going to provide involuntary coordination of body movements. So a lot of your refined movements, even on the skeletal muscle, which I know are voluntary structures, even your more refined movements will be found in the cerebellum. Okay, a lot of times when they look at scans of athletes' brains, they'll find this area, their cerebellum, is larger than the average human being. Okay, perhaps connecting them with their athletic